While I was on a business trip, my parents sold my dream sports car to fund my sister's luxury getaway. When I came back, my mom sneered, "Thanks to your car, our daughter is having the time of her life." I chuckled, and she snapped, "What's so funny?" Her smile vanished when I told her, because the car they sold was not the one I had left behind. My name is Quinn Callahan. At 30 years old, living in the structured world of corporate finance, I was known as the logical one, the kid who never needed anything. It was a role assigned to me in childhood and solidified by my sister, Sienna. She was the one who needed attention, comfort, and money, treated like fragile glass deserving of every luxury. For me, independence was not a choice, it was a demand. That need for self-made proof was why I poured years of my 20s into saving, trading long nights, and ramen dinners for the promise of something real. The focus of that quiet ambition was a 1996 Dodge Viper GTS in cobalt blue. It was more than a vehicle. It was the physical proof that the sacrifices and long hours meant something. It was tangible evidence that I wasn't just the dependable backup plan for my family. I inherited this appreciation from my grandfather. I still remember the smell of motor oil and metal dust in his garage. He once let me place my hand on the warm engine block of his old Viper and told me, "Machines don't lie to you, kid. You treat them right, they'll give you everything they've got." That moment became the blueprint for my life. Honest work equals honest return. My family, however, never saw the Viper that way. To my mother, Lorraine, it was instantly flashy and unnecessary. My hard-earned milestone was just a frivolous phase. The opportunity that would change my career and ultimately force a collision with my family arrived with a negotiation trip to Seattle. 3 weeks away from Austin meant 3 weeks the Viper would be vulnerable. Against my better judgment, I convinced myself my parents' quiet, small-town garage would be the safest place. My father looked at the car with a flicker of admiration that briefly warmed me. But Lorraine's eyes instantly narrowed in disapproval. "That car looks too expensive," she said flatly, cementing my long-held mistrust. As I prepared to leave the car with them, my partner, Kai, voiced his serious concern. He was the only person who understood the emotional and mechanical language I spoke. "I don't trust this," he whispered. "Your family doesn't respect what this car means to you." After a careful discussion, we formulated a desperate, proactive plan. Before I handed over the keys, Kai and I covertly swapped my real Viper for his identical replica. Leaving the stand in their garage, Lorraine noticed nothing, smiling a tight, expectant smile as I walked out the door. "When you come home," she said, her eyes vacant, "there'll be a wonderful surprise waiting. Something the whole family can enjoy." The weight of her words felt less like a promise and more like a carefully aimed threat. I had established the boundary, but my family had been crossing it for so long, the gesture felt fragile, temporary. Despite my careful planning, the rest of the house slept, that accompanied any interaction with my parents, tightened its grip as the departure date for Seattle approached. The professional stakes of the negotiation trip were enormous, but the only thing I could focus on was the empty space in my stomach created by trusting Lorraine with my property. I had tried every alternative for the Viper. I considered a secure rental garage on the outskirts of Austin, but the costs were astronomical and the security unverified. A friend's place felt too risky. The car was conspicuous, and I didn't want to burden anyone for 3 weeks. The choice, regrettably, came down to my childhood home in Bourne, Texas. It was a small town where people still knew their neighbors. And my father, whatever his faults, was meticulously careful with his own old pickup truck. It was the Willie place that felt genuinely secure, ironically because of the distance I had put between myself and the people living inside it. The evening I drove the replica to the house, the low rumble of the engine vibrating through the quiet street. My father, Stan, stepped out first. He squinted against the Texas sun, but the look on his face, that genuine, open admiration I rarely saw directed at me, momentarily softened something brittle inside me. He walked around the cobalt blue shell, tracing the racing stripe with a work-worn finger. "She's a beauty, son," he said, and for that brief moment, I felt a flicker of the familial pride I'd been working for 30 years to earn. Then Lorraine emerged onto the porch, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and the feeling instantly evaporated. Her eyes didn't linger on the car's design or power. They assessed the price tag, judging the expenditure. "That car looks too expensive," she stated, the judgment flat and final. Not everything flashy is meant for a grown man. To her, the car wasn't a hard-won milestone, it was proof of my extravagance, a problem waiting to happen. The old role was immediately reinforced. My value was in being Spartan, stable, and requiring nothing. Before the irritation could take root, Kai pulled into the driveway behind me. Having followed me from Austin, he took in the entire scene with one swift glance, the awe on Stan's face, the disapproval etched into Lorraine's posture, and the tension tightening my shoulders. He pulled me aside near the mailbox, the asphalt still warm beneath our feet. "I don't trust this, Quinn," he whispered, his voice low and serious. "She looks at that car like an asset to be liquidated, not a dream to be protected. Your family doesn't respect what this car means to you." The truth of his statement was undeniable, but the idea of keeping the real Viper safe felt overwhelming. Kai had foreseen this moment, however. He reminded me of the identical replica he kept in his own garage, used for track days and appearances. "I have the replica in my garage," he urged. "Let's switch them before you leave. They won't notice the difference." They never cared enough to look closely. After an hour of debating, the weight of my mother's disapproval acting as the decisive factor, I agreed. While Stan and Lorraine were distracted inside making dinner, Kai and I executed the switch in the twilight. The replica, identical down to the racing stripe and the custom plates, was tucked into the garage. The real Viper, my proof, was gone, concealed elsewhere. My parents hadn't heard a thing, confirming Kai's cynical hypothesis. They didn't care about the car itself, only its presence and its perceived value. The next morning, suitcase packed, I was almost out the door when Lorraine stopped me, her smile wide but cold. "When you come home," she said, her voice light, "there'll be a wonderful surprise waiting, something the whole family can enjoy." The weight of the comment settled heavily on my chest. It was meant to sound vague and pleasant. Perhaps a new appliance. But a few nights before, Sienna had mentioned her friends planning an expensive Caribbean cruise, sighing dramatically about how much she deserved an escape. The way Lorraine glanced at me then, slow and deliberate, made the pit of dread in my gut deepen. Family helps family, she had coached softly that night at dinner. I pretended not to hear the ground shifting beneath me, but the air felt charged. The storm was coming, and I knew deep down it was going to cost me more than a new kitchen appliance. I just didn't yet know I had already shielded myself from the worst of the disaster. Seattle greeted me with the cold, ceaseless drizzle of late fall. The gray sky sat so low it pressed down, a heavy contrast to the dry, relentless heat of Texas I was accustomed to. I tried to focus entirely on the negotiation trip, a pivotal assignment that could reshape my entire career trajectory at the firm. I was leading the team, responsible for securing a major deal with a Japanese partner, and the stakes were high enough to justify the 16-hour days I was putting in. I buried myself in the spreadsheets, the market analysis, and the endless rehearsal of presentations. Yet, no matter how deeply I dug into the work, a sharp, cold unease kept tugging at me, quiet at first, then louder, like a wire tightening around my concentration. It was the same feeling I had when dealing with my family, an intuitive warning that something had shifted off kilter. I called home on the second night. Stan, my father, sounded unusually cheerful. He reported that he had started the car exactly as I'd instructed, letting it run for 15 minutes to keep the fluid moving. He even remarked how smooth the engine sounded. This seemed normal, even reassuring. But when I asked to speak to Lorraine, her voice was clipped and rushed. "The car is fine, Quinn. Stop worrying about small things." Her tone wasn't just dismissive, it was tight, almost defensive, as if she needed to end the conversation before I asked a clarifying question. The next morning, a text from her popped up. During my commute to the offices. It simply read, "Sienna is bright again. Thanks to something wonderful you'll see when you return." She didn't elaborate, didn't add emojis or any of her usual conversational filler. The intentional omission felt like a calculated move. My family was never subtle. This strange secrecy indicated a coordinated effort. They were hiding something, and my gut instantly pointed to the only valuable thing I had left in their care. My attention became split. During meetings, I watched the conference room clock, counting the hours until I could discreetly check my phone again. The negotiation demanded ruthless logic, but my internal monologue was dominated by speculation and dread. What exactly was the wonderful surprise? A new kitchen appliance? Or had the family help? Sienna hinted at come to fruition. A few days later, Kai called. His voice was calm, but the tension underneath it was obvious. He was typically reserved and unflappable, so his unusual anxiety immediately elevated my own. "I've tried calling your mom twice," he said. She answered. But her tone, "Quinn, it's not right." She was short, almost defensive. "I think something's going on that they're not telling you." The unease tightened into a cold knot. We discussed the replica. It was identical, true, but the replica's vehicle identification number, its VN, was different, and the engine, while performing well, was not the original, rebuilt soul of my dream car. Any real buyer, especially one seeking a vintage GTS, would run a check, but Lorraine had always been sloppy with paperwork, assuming her authority extended over legal processes. I kept checking the family group chat, hoping for a sign of normalcy. An argument about yard work. Anything mundane. Then, one afternoon, they sent a photo. It was a picture of Lorraine, Stan, and Sienna smiling in the driveway, arms linked. The photograph itself was innocuous, but in the background, the garage door stood wide open, and the cobalt blue car was nowhere inside. It was empty. My stomach twisted violently. I immediately texted my father, trying to sound casual. "Where did you put the car, Dad?" "Out for service." His reply was too quick, too eager. "Old photo, don't worry." The lie wasn't even well constructed. I remember the shirts they were wearing, they were the exact ones they'd worn in another photo posted. Just that morning, celebrating Sienna's final day of struggle before her getaway, I was preparing for a midnight rehearsal with our Japanese partners when my phone buzzed again. This time with a text from an unfamiliar number. It was Mrs. Halstead, our old neighbor from Bourne. She never messaged unless it was important, and her tone was always understated. Nova dear. The message read, using my old nickname. I saw a truck tow your car last week. I assumed you were moving. My chest seized. The air was knocked from my lungs. I wanted to call immediately. Confront them. Demand real answers. But I was already being pulled into the crucial meeting. I shoved the phone into my pocket. The cold rain hammering against the conference room glass, barely audible, over the chaotic thumping of my own pulse. The next 2 hours were the longest of my life, a blur of numbers and forced smiles as I presented my findings. I felt like I was operating outside my own body. When the meeting finally ended, and the contract details were approved, I stood outside the skyscraper, the rain soaking through my blazer. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Lorraine. It confirmed everything the neighbor had suggested. The photo had shown, and Kai had warned. Sienna is enjoying the trip she deserves. The text stated. No mention of the car, no explanation, only that quiet, self-justifying confirmation of the consequence. The rain blurred the words on the screen, but the meaning was brutally, painfully clear. Something was very, very wrong, and I knew exactly what they had done. They had sold the car. The final presentation the next day was successful. Signed agreement, handshakes. Congratulations from my superiors. I should have felt triumphant, but my mind was consumed by the image of the empty garage. I felt rage, a cold, focused anger I hadn't realized I was capable of. The betrayal was complete. They had taken the only thing I had ever bought purely for myself. The symbol of my independent success, and liquidated it to fund the continued entitlement of my sister. I booked an earlier flight back to Austin. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't want rehearsed excuses or a preemptive defense. I needed clarity, and I needed to face them, while the consequences of their actions were still raw and undefended. Back in Austin, the warm air felt heavier than usual. I drove straight to Bourne, my eyes fixed on the road, replaying every unanswered question, every lie. The sun was starting to set when I turned into my parents' driveway, and the sight waiting for me in the amber light was the final, undeniable confirmation. The garage door was wide open, and the replica Viper was nowhere inside. My heart hammered against my ribs, anticipating the confrontation that would either finally fix my family or destroy it entirely. The warm Austin air felt heavy, oppressive, as I drove the final few miles into Bourne. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the familiar street in a bruised, orange light. Every single suspicion I had harbored had been confirmed. The car was gone. The open, empty mouth of my parents' garage was the final, undeniable proof. My heart hammered a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I got out of my rental car, not bothering to retrieve my suitcase, and walked toward the front door. Before I could knock, Lorraine pulled it open. Her expression wasn't one of surprise or relief at seeing me home early. It was irritated, almost inconvenienced, as if my early arrival had interrupted her evening plans. "Quinn," she said, her voice dry. "You're early. The deal was successful." "I presume." I ignored the question, stepping across the threshold. The house was too quiet. The usual evening sounds, the television, the clatter of plates, were absent. Stan was visible, hovering awkwardly in the hallway behind her, his posture rigid. "Where is it?" I asked, my voice calm. Flat, betraying none of the seismic chaos churning inside me. Lorraine crossed her arms, her chin lifting with that familiar, righteous confidence that always signaled she was prepared to defend an indefensible action. She didn't hesitate. She looked me dead in the eye and sneered. Thanks to your car, our daughter is having the time of her life. Ugh. The ringing in my ears intensified. A wave of heat rolled across my face. But instead of shouting, instead of releasing the years of rage that had been building toward this moment, I laughed. It was a short, sharp, breathless sound, completely devoid of humor. It was a sound I barely recognized coming from myself. It was the sound of disbelief so profound, so absolute, that it almost knocked the air out of my lungs. They had done it. They had taken the one thing that was unequivocally mine, the symbol of myself, made success, and casually converted it into an allowance for Sienna's entitlement. Lorraine's eyes narrowed instantly, and her smile vanished. What's funny, Quinn? She snapped. Stan shifted uncomfortably behind her, his guilt written across every tight muscle in his shoulders. I looked between them, my pulse thudding like a drum. I saw not two parents who had made a mistake, but two collaborators who had executed a planned theft, secure in the knowledge that I would, as always, be the one to absorb the damage. Tell me exactly what you did, I asked, the clarity that had settled over me now chillingly absolute. Lorraine waved a dismissive hand. We sold it. We got a good price, too. And don't start lecturing us. Your sister needed a break. She's on a Caribbean cruise right now, getting the rest she deserves. My stomach twisted with a sickening jolt. How much did you sell it for? Stan swallowed hard, his eyes glued to the pattern on the carpet. Lorraine finally looked away, refusing to meet my gaze. When they finally murmured the number, it was low, criminally insulting. They hadn't researched the market. They hadn't appraised the unique value of the GTS model. They hadn't even called Kai, who knew more about that car than anyone. They just wanted fast money. You sold it that fast? I asked quietly. Without calling me, without asking anything, without even wondering if it was insured correctly or if it was the right car. Lorraine bristled, regaining her defensive posture. Stop overreacting. It's only a car. Family comes first. I took a step closer, letting the silence stretch, watching their confidence falter under the weight of their own terrible assumption. Lorraine's righteous certainty began to tremble. Finally, I delivered the blow slowly, clearly, letting each word land with surgical precision. The car you sold wasn't mine. The room froze around us. The air turned brittle. Every lie, every casual justification, every assumption they had ever made about my endless capacity for sacrifice collapsed in on itself as they waited for an explanation they were nowhere near prepared to hear. Lorraine's hand slipped from her crossed arms, falling uselessly to her side. Stan's jaw slackened, the muscles in his face giving way to pure, unadulterated horror. They knew instantly what I meant. I explained everything. That Kai and I had switched the cars before my trip. That the real Viper, my Viper, was safe in Austin, locked down in Kai's climate-controlled storage unit. That the car they sold, the one they used as currency for Sienna's entitlement, belonged entirely to Kai Mercer. The more I spoke, the paler Lorraine became. Stan, meanwhile, sank heavily into the nearest dining chair, running a shaking hand over his face. You sold a car that wasn't yours, I stated, the realization echoing loudly in the silent house. A car you had no legal right to touch. You forged signatures on the title transfer. You issued a bill of sale for property you didn't own. Stan looked up, his voice barely a whisper. Quinn. Are you telling me we committed a crime? Lorraine snapped back to life, clutching at her last defense. The familiar cry of the entitled parent. You should have told us! You should have said something. How were we supposed to know it wasn't the same car? That doesn't excuse anything, I replied. the years of buried resentment rising with the certainty of my words. You didn't ask. You didn't check. You didn't even hesitate. The money was just lying there, and you assumed it was yours for the taking. The car was just the catalyst. This was about decades of being expected to sacrifice, while Sienna was shielded from the smallest consequence of her own choices. Before they could respond, my phone buzzed with an incoming text from an unknown number. I opened it immediately. Is this Quinn Callahan? I answered the call that followed. Yes, it is. This is Elliot Granger. I purchased the Dodge from your parents. The paperwork isn't valid. The signatures don't match state records. And the VIN isn't real. I'd like an explanation before I contact law enforcement. Stan's face crumpled. Lorraine pressed a hand to her chest as though the air had turned poisonous. The internal family betrayal had instantly morphed into an external legal disaster. Give me an hour, Elliot, I said, forcing calm into my voice. I'll sort this out. I hung up. Immediately, the phone rang again. It was Sienna. Her voice, bright and careless, was underscored by loud Caribbean music in the background. Quinn, did Mom tell you I'm finally on a real vacation? Isn't that fun? I clenched my jaw, struggling to maintain the cool detachment I needed. Sienna, why did Mom think selling my car was okay? Oh, come on, she scoffed. It's just a car. You make good money. You can buy another. Besides, it was just sitting in the garage doing nothing. So you knew, I said quietly. A pause, followed by a weak, defensive attempt at innocence. I might have mentioned that you weren't using it. And Mom said she'd figure something out. I didn't think she'd, actually sell it. She sounded annoyed that her getaway was being interrupted, not guilty about the cause. Sienna, I said, pushing the words through my teeth. Elliot is threatening to call the police. This isn't a misunderstanding. It's a crime. Another, longer pause, followed by a defensive huff. Why are you being so dramatic? We're family. Family should help each other. A family help. Words they used only when I was the one expected to sacrifice. The final, suffocating blow came when I noticed Lorraine's phone, which she had dropped on the counter. A recent notification lit up the screen, and I saw the preview. Loan payment due. Sienna's balance, clearly still massive and unpaid. In that instant, everything aligned: the desperate favoritism, the excuses, the rushed, fraudulent sale. My parents hadn't sold the car just to give Sienna a vacation. They were drowning in debt from covering her choices, and instead of confronting her, they had chosen to steal from me, their reliable resource, once again. I looked at all three of them. Sienna via the phone, Lorraine clutching her heart, and Stan bowed and defeated. This wasn't a mistake. This was the culmination of years of entitlement and moral avoidance. And now, the consequences were closing in, tangible and legal. I knew, absolutely, that I could no longer manage their consequences for them. This had to end now. The silence following my realization that their theft was driven by Sienna's massive, unpaid debt wasn't just quiet. It was the sound of 3 decades of family myth collapsing into dust. I couldn't just walk away and let them face the legal fallout. Not yet. My anger was cold and functional now, focusing entirely on damage control. The first thing I did the next morning was call Dana Whitlock, a colleague turned friend who specialized in criminal defense. We met at a quiet cafe downtown. The city noise is a stark contrast to the stifling dread of my parents' house. I laid out every detail: the Viper swap, the fraudulent bill of sale, the undervalued price, and the buyer, Elliot Granger, who now held all the leverage. Dana listened intently, her expression darkening with every sentence. Quinn, she said, pushing a notebook toward me. Your parents are looking at multiple serious charges. Unauthorized sale of property, forgery on the title transfer, fraudulent transfer, and potentially felony theft, depending on how Elliot frames it to the district attorney. The words landed like physical blows. Felony theft. She spoke of numbers I couldn't comprehend in the context of my suburban parents 4 to 15 years behind bars. Lorraine and Stan weren't malicious people, but they were careless, entitled, and so bending me to their will that they genuinely didn't realize the legal world didn't bend in the same direction. They were used to emotional consequences, not penal ones. Dana emphasized that even if Elliot agreed to a private resolution, the state could still intervene if they viewed this as intentional fraud. They have zero room to hide, Quinn. The evidence is all external, the wrong VN. The forged signatures, the neighbor's testimony. This isn't just about paying back the money. When I returned to Bourne, the atmosphere reminded me of a funeral home. It was silent, heavy, and thick with the dread of inevitable consequences. Lorraine looked smaller, somehow stripped of her usual certainty. Stan wouldn't meet my eyes. Dana says prison is a possibility. I told them, my voice neutral and detached. This isn't something we can ignore or minimize with a quick excuse. This is about legal action. Lorraine trembled, her hands twisting her apron. Quinn, please, we didn't mean. It was just for Sienna. We didn't think. This isn't about intentions. I interrupted, cutting through the familiar deflection. This is about actions. And the consequences are real and outside of our family system now. We reviewed the fraudulent contract they had signed with Elliot. It was a disaster. Incorrect vehicle identification number, clearly forged signature that didn't match Stan's driver's license. And the price was wildly undervalued, the kind of document that screamed fraud. Later that afternoon, while they sat silently in the oppressive living room, my phone vibrated again. It was Elliot Granger. He wasn't making threats anymore, he was demanding action. If I didn't receive an explanation, and my money back within 24 hours, he would file a criminal complaint. Stan's face crumpled as he stared at the message. The same dread as someone watching a wildfire creep toward their home. Lorraine pressed her palm to her forehead. Silent now, the realization of potential felony charges silencing her usual self-justification. For the first time, the weight of our family's dysfunction wasn't just emotional, it was legally tangible and rapidly closing in. In that terrible silence, my phone rang again. It was Sienna. Her voice, bright and carefree, was still layered over loud, distant calypso music. Quinn! I was just texting Mom. But she's not answering. Did you talk to her? Is she still mad about the car thing? I took a deep breath. Sienna. Elliot is threatening to call the police. This isn't a misunderstanding, it's a crime. A pause, longer this time, finally breaking through the cruise ship bubble. Then, the defensive huff. Why are you being so dramatic? We're family. Family should help each other. Family help. I repeated, the irony stinging my throat. Words you only use when I'm the one who has to sacrifice. You benefited from this theft, Sienna. I have texts showing you encouraged Mom to sell the car. That's not the same as being responsible, she protested, sounding genuinely annoyed that her getaway was being interrupted by my crisis. Legally, it might be, I replied, the cold clarity steadying my voice. Morally, it definitely is. Your debt, your entitled demands, and your refusal to ever face reality is why they risk prison for you. The conversation ended with her hanging up in a fit of defensive annoyance. The exchange was proof. She felt zero culpability. The walls of my parents' house felt too tight, the air too thin. I knew then I couldn't simply cover for them. I had spent 30 years being the emotional safety net. Now, I would use the legal threat as leverage. I decided I would negotiate Elliot's withdrawal. But only if the entire family, including Sienna, committed to the terms of restitution I was about to set. It was the only way to ensure the consequences landed where they belonged, not just financially, but ethically. I needed a commitment that this family structure would fundamentally change, or I would step aside and let the criminal justice system complete the job I never could. The time for excuses was over. The consequences demanded a reckoning on my own terms. I couldn't hold this crucial family summit in the house, where Lorraine's influence still reigned, where the very walls seemed imbued with the assumption of my endless sacrifice. I needed neutral ground, or rather, my ground. I invited them to my small apartment in Austin. When they arrived, they brought with them the same mix of annoyance and defensiveness that had defined my whole life. Sienna, forced to return from the Caribbean early when I cut off her access to funds, kept her designer sunglasses perched on her head, clearly trying to project the image that she was still on vacation. Stan hovered behind Lorraine like a nervous shadow, waiting for permission to breathe or speak. I had arranged the dining table not for dinner, but for clarity. I laid out every piece of evidence like artifacts from an archaeological dig: the fraudulent bill of sale, the screenshot of the missing car from the family chat, the messages Sienna had sent encouraging the sale, and Dana's summary of the potential criminal charges. It wasn't arranged for drama. It was arranged so none of them could claim confusion or miscommunication again. When everyone was settled, I spoke from the first person place I had avoided for 30 years. I didn't talk about the car first. I told them what it felt like to grow up as the designated, strong one, the one expected to sacrifice, the one who was never granted softness or consideration. I spoke about the humiliation of pouring years of work into a dream, only to have it dismissed and stolen in a heartbeat. I made it clear that their actions didn't just cause financial chaos, they endangered me legally, and they definitively proved that they never took my boundaries seriously. Lorraine immediately latched onto the familiar, dissolving defense. We are family. Quinn, there's nothing here that can't be forgiven. Why make this bigger than it needs to be? Stan's expression wavered, torn between finally taking responsibility and retreating into his usual silence. He opened his mouth twice before shutting it again. Sienna, ever dismissive, shrugged, leaning back in her chair. I didn't sell anything. I just suggested it. Mom thought it was a good idea. Don't pin this on me. I slid the evidence toward her. The messages she'd sent encouraging the sale. The screenshot where she implied my car was collecting dust. The photo of Lorraine literally handing the keys to the buyer. This isn't speculation, I said. This is what happened. You benefited, and you encouraged it. The discussion spiraled quickly into raised voices, shattered illusions, and buried pain clawing its way to the surface. I spoke about the lifetime of being dismissed. Lorraine flinched, not because she disagreed with the facts, but because hearing them spoken aloud disrupted the story she'd always told herself. The story where she was the benevolent, caring matriarch. You make it sound like we abused you, she said, her voice trembling, wavering between pure defensiveness and something softer. Something akin to realization. I make it sound like I existed. I answered, the words coming out clean and sharp. And none of you noticed. Sienna rolled her eyes, instantly trying to pull the focus back to her own inconvenience. You're acting like the victim because of one car. You always need to be dramatic. That comment lit the final fuse. This isn't about a car, I said, my voice rising and cracking slightly, but holding firm. This is about 30 years of being treated as if my job was to carry everyone else's burden. It's about being nothing more than a resource to steal from when your preferred child ran out of money. The room went dead still. Then, I set the terms. I stood over the table, hands flat on the wood, looking at each of them in turn. You have two options, I said. You take responsibility. Financially and legally. All of you. Or I call Elliot Granger back, tell him I cannot resolve this privately, and let him handle this through the system. Lorraine's breath hitched, a small, choked sound. Stan's hands shook violently in his lap. Sienna finally, dramatically, took her sunglasses off, her eyes wide with fear. Stan spoke first, quietly, almost too quietly. I've been afraid to disagree with your mother. He confessed, the admission stunning the room. Even Sienna turned toward him in shock. She always took the lead with you kids. I let it happen because it was easier. That's on me. I should have stood up for you. His confession, simple and overdue, cracked Lorraine's composition. She lowered herself into a chair, as if the gravity of the room had suddenly increased tenfold. I always thought you were strong, she whispered, tears slipping down her face, the first honest emotion I had seen from her in years. Stronger than Sienna. I thought you didn't need anything. I didn't realize how deep this would go. I didn't realize I was hurting you. That's the problem, I said, sitting opposite them. You never saw me as someone who also needed support. You only saw me as someone who provided it. I slid the final written plan across the table. It required full repayment to Elliot, $6,000 in additional damages for the legal stress, a notarized apology, and a commitment to 8 weeks of mandatory family therapy to address the underlying pattern of favoritism and entitlement. Lorraine broke completely, sobbing openly. I don't want to lose you, Quinn, she choked out. You already did, I said, simply. This is your chance to earn me back. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was the sound of an entire family structure cracking open. Acknowledging its dysfunction, and facing a consequence that, for the first time, they couldn't simply hand over to me to fix. The signed agreement marked the end of the conflict. But the true journey of restitution was just beginning. Stan had picked up the pen first, his quiet confession followed by his signature, an act of defiance against Lorraine's decades of control. Sienna, defiant until the last minute, stared at her mother's tearful breakdown, then at the legal documents, and finally signed her portion, committing to her debt. Lorraine hesitated the longest, her hand trembling as she finally conceded defeat, signing below the others. The terms were non-negotiable. Full repayment to Elliot Granger of the purchase price, plus $6,000 in damages, a notarized apology, acknowledging wrongdoing and legal fraud, and a mandatory commitment to 8 weeks of family therapy to address the root patterns. For the first time, responsibility was being distributed evenly, slept landing squarely on the shoulders of the people who had caused the damage. The financial pressure was immediate and unavoidable. My parents applied for a home equity loan to cover the bulk of the repayment. It was a painful, humiliating process, but it was necessary. Sienna, angry, embarrassed, and finally humbled, sold off her designer collection. The shoes, the bags, The clothes she had prioritized over real life and contributed the bulk of what she owed. They didn't want to. But responsibility doesn't ask for comfort. 2 days later, Kai and I drove the 500 miles to Santa Fe to meet Elliot Granger in person. The tension in the air was no longer antagonistic. It was procedural, cautious. Elliot, a meticulous man with a keen legal sense, arrived with his folder and a lawyer's measured gaze. We handed him the bank draft for the full refund and the compensation documents, along with the notarized apology detailing the fraudulent transfer. He read every document carefully, checking the state seals and confirming the bank codes. "I'm satisfied," he said finally, signing the agreement to void the sale and close the matter permanently without escalating to the police. The moment his signature was placed on the page, something tight and heavy loosened in my chest. It wasn't relief, but the quiet awareness that the worst of the external crisis was finally over. We then drove to retrieve Kai's replica from Elliot's storage unit in New Mexico. I walked around the cobalt blue shell slowly, inspecting each surface. Knowing what had happened, what this car, the stand-in, had been mistakenly dragged into, gave it a strange, symbolic weight. It wasn't just a vehicle anymore. It was the catalyst that had forced every fracture in my family to the surface. Back in Texas, the terms of the agreement began unfolding quickly. Sienna, now without her safety net and facing real financial obligations, started applying for actual jobs. Within a month, she moved to Dallas for a position in marketing. I expected only silence, but one day, a text arrived from her that surprised me more than anything she had said all year. "Thank you for forcing me to face reality," it read. I didn't know how stuck I was. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was an undeniable beginning, a first acknowledgement of accountability. Stan reached out more than he ever had before. He called one evening, not to talk about Lorraine or Sienna, but to ask if I would help him restore an old pickup truck that belonged to my grandfather's ranch. Every weekend, slowly, steadily, we began working side by side in his garage. I watched him take interest, show effort, and ask technical questions about the engine. Things I had never seen him do when I was young. He was asking me for help, but also offering partnership, a genuine trade of skill for time. Lorraine began her therapy sessions, and for once, she didn't resist the process. She entered each session acknowledging her patterns, her need for control, her favoritism, her immense blind spots regarding her eldest son. She was forced to apologize without excuses, without defensiveness, even when the conversations became heavy and difficult. I still didn't forgive immediately. I couldn't. But I listened, and I watched the actions. The pain wasn't gone, but it wasn't dominating me anymore. I knew I was moving in the right direction, putting space between my past resentment and my future boundaries. The road ahead was long, but at least now, I was driving it alone, and they were finally walking their own paths toward responsibility. The Viper was finally safe, not just physically, but symbolically. I was finally steering my own life. One morning, a few weeks after the final payment to Elliot was processed, I took the real Viper out alone. I drove the winding road along Lake Travis, the engine roaring the way my grandfather taught me to appreciate. Steady, honest, alive. The cobalt blue paint reflected the Texas sky as I moved through the curves of the road, and the smooth power vibrating through the chassis was a constant, honest language. In that quiet solitude, somewhere between the sharp curves and the reflection of the lake, I realized how far I'd come. This wasn't about a car. It never had been. It was about the years I'd allowed myself to shrink for the sake sake of an impossible peace. It was about reclaiming the parts of me I had let go, so my family could stay comfortable in their entitlement. The theft of the replica had been the catalyst, forcing a crack in the foundation of my life so that light and truth could finally get in. The road trip turned into reflection. I thought about Lorraine, now committed to therapy. For once, she was showing up for the process without the usual resistance. I remembered a dinner last Sunday, where, unprompted, she had actually asked how I was doing before describing her own session. It was a subtle change, but it felt like a monumental effort on her part. She was examining her blind spots and apologizing without excuses, even when the conversations got heavy. I didn't instantly forgive her, but I listened, which was more than I had done for decades. I thought about Stan, my father. We still met in his garage on weekends, working side by side on the old pickup truck. He was slower, more deliberate, asking questions, showing effort, and taking genuine interest. He wasn't just looking for a chore to justify his presence, he was looking for a bridge. One Saturday, he paused, wiping grease from his hands, and said, "I let your mother take the lead because it was easier. I never should have let that silence define our relationship." His apology wasn't just about the car. It was about the lifetime of neglect he'd chosen. And Sienna. The shift in her life was the most dramatic. She was 300 miles away in Dallas, working a demanding marketing job, forced to pay her own debts and manage her own life. Responsibility, for the first time, wasn't an optional concept. Her text, "Thank you for forcing me to face reality," surprised me because for the first time, it completely lacked self-pity. She was still Sienna, prone to drama, but now she was earning her own way, and that, too, felt like a beginning. In the weeks that followed, my family shifted subtly, but undeniably. At that Sunday dinner, Stan and Lorraine talked about themselves, only after asking about my career and my life. Sienna shared stories from work, without bragging, or playing the victim. Lorraine remained quiet when others spoke, letting conversations breathe in ways she never used to. The pain wasn't gone, but it wasn't dominating me anymore. I realized something important about boundaries. They aren't walls built to keep others out. They are doors I choose to close, and I choose carefully who I let back in. For years, I kept mine wide open, hoping my family would enter with respect. Instead, they entered with the expectations and the confidence that I would always bend to keep the peace. What happened was about finally choosing to close that door and defining my life on my own terms. Forgiveness, I learned, isn't a switch you flip. It's a long road with winding turns. Some days, the road is smooth, and I feel a genuine connection with my father during a quiet afternoon in the garage. Slept. Some days, the past tugs harder, and the old resentment flickers, especially when Lorraine says something that echoes her old dismissiveness. But healing doesn't require perfection, just movement. And I was moving, slowly, steadily, honestly. My family was moving, too, not because I demanded change, but because I finally held my ground long enough for them to choose it for themselves. My self-worth was no longer measured by how much I tolerated or how much I gave up. I was allowed to protect what mattered to me. The dream, the peace, and the version of myself I had worked so hard to become. I looked at the Viper, waiting in the garage when I got home from that drive. Cobalt blue gleaming in the afternoon light. It wasn't just a dream fulfilled. It was a reminder I deserve respect. I deserve boundaries. I deserve a life that is mine, defined by my choices, not by my capacity for sacrifice. And that was the road I finally chose to travel. If there's one thing I hope someone, listening, takes from my story, it's this: you're allowed to say no. You're allowed to draw lines. And you're allowed to build a life that doesn't revolve around keeping everyone else comfortable. I often think about my grandfather lately. About the afternoons in his garage, the smell of oil and dust, the hum of the radio, the slow patience in his voice when he showed me how to loosen a stubborn bolt. "Machines don't lie," he said. "You treat them right, they'll give you everything they've got." Funny how that ended up being a lesson about people too. About who deserved space in my life, and who had to earn a second chance. And now, standing here, listening to the Viper settle into that familiar post, drive warmth, I finally feel like I'm stepping into the version of myself he always believed I could be. Not defined by what I provide, or what I fix, or what I sacrifice, but by the red shoes to protect. I hope in some small way, my story reminds you that it's okay to choose yourself, too.